B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, June 9th, 2020. As George Floyd is laid to rest after a final memorial service in Houston today, we're seeing that the 2 weeks of George Floyd protests, almost daily, in all 50 states, are leading to a sharp change in public opinion. And this is something that I deeply welcome because that public opinion influences politicians who will feel both emboldened and pressured to make substantial change. At least we can hope for it. So I don't usually spend a lot of time discussing polls. I think especially in radio or audio, podcast land here, that it can be hard to grasp and that polls are easier digested when you can see them graphed out. But roll with me, will you? Americans overwhelmingly support the nationwide protests that have taken place. Trump receives negative marks for his handling of the protests, with 61% saying they disapprove and only 35% saying they approve of his handling. 47% of Americans say they strongly disapprove of the way the president has responded to the protests. More than 2 in 3 Americans, that's 69%, say the killing of Floyd represents a broader problem within law enforcement, compared with fewer than 1 in 3 at 29%, who say that the Minneapolis killing is an isolated incident. And 6 years ago, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, 43% said those deaths were indicative of broader problems, while more than half saw that as an isolated incident. Overall, 74% of Americans say they support the protests that have been carried out since the May 25th killing of Floyd. 87% of Democrats support them, 76% of independents, and 53% of Republicans. Now, that is an impressive array of numbers. The widespread support for the protests comes amid mixed views of whether the events have been mostly peaceful or mostly violent, and that really breaks down on partisan lines and probably whether you watch Fox News. 43% say the protests have been mostly peaceful. If you ask people who identify as liberals, 70% say mostly peaceful. Democrats, 56%. But conservatives at 60% and Republicans at 65% say they were largely violent. Now, the timing of the poll is significant because we did have a few nights of rage and the looting and some violent acts like the burning of the police precinct station in Minneapolis. Independents are split similarly to the country overall. 44% say the protests mostly peaceful, 42% mostly violent. And I'd love to see an actual factual breakdown of the extent to which, various events were entirely peaceful, those which involved minor incidents of violence or looting, and those that, where things clearly did cross a line. Among those who say the protests were mostly violent, 53% support the nationwide demonstrations, while 46% oppose them. So that is still strong support. Among those who said the protests have been largely peaceful, 91% support them. So it is fascinating, too, the view of the police brutality that we have witnessed on our television screens, and some people in person. 50% of all Americans in the poll say the police have been handling demonstrations by peaceful protesters about right, while 44% say that law enforcement have used too much force. I struggle to see how half of the people can say that it's about right when you see the gross overreaction, the criminal behavior of police in many cities, way too many cities. Now, when you separate out the looting and vandalization, 47% say police have not used enough force. 34% say that it was handled about right. 16% say too much force was used. Well, in my view, the police were generally absent from the scenes of widespread looting. And so to rate how much force they used when they weren't even present, well, polls are only as good as the questions that you ask. All right, now that I've got you on polling, let me feed one more to you. Because Trump's personal ratings in a separate poll have dropped sharply. His approval rating has fallen to negative 12% among registered or likely voters, down from negative 6.7 on April 15th. This comes from a compilation of polls at 5:38. And now a wave of polls show Joe Biden with a significant national lead, placing him in a stronger position to beat an incumbent president than any challenger since Bill Clinton in the summer of '92. He leads the president by around 10 percentage points in an average of recent live interview telephone surveys of registered voters. And Trump is losing ground with women. He trails Biden by 25 points among them, far worse than his 14-point deficit 4 years ago. He still leads among men by 6 points in the most recent polls. Over the shorter term, the decline in his standing has been particularly pronounced among white voters without a college degree. And that group had been backing the president by, let me get this right. It was 31 points in March, and it's down to 21 points in May. So this shows that Trump may be on a path to defeating himself. And that Joe Biden, if he can avoid further gaffes and also avoid being tagged with his lengthy record, as we'll discuss here in just a second, he might be able to eke out a victory over Trump in November. Now, this broke over the news here just as I was sitting down to record today's podcast. In the old days, we say this just came in over the wire. Well, today I'll say it just came in over the wireless. In the District of Columbia, the council has passed a resolution unanimously, despite a letter from Mayor Muriel Bowser asking them to slow down, hold public hearings before passing the legislation. And she wants community input and vetting by residents. But the council is in a hurry to show action. Now, the vote today puts these changes in place for 90 days, which can be extended to 225 days with a second vote. So they are temporary. To make the measures permanent, the council would need to hold public hearings and vote again. So I guess this is considered emergency legislation. It bans the Metropolitan Police Department from using chemical irritants or rubber bullets to disperse peaceful protesters. It gives felons incarcerated in the D.C. jail the right to vote. It makes it a felony for a police officer to use a neck restraint on someone. It also aims to leave the police union out of disciplinary process. It makes changes to the groups tasked with overseeing police misconduct, and it requires the city to publish within 72 hours of a serious use of force the name of the officer or officers involved and their body camera footage. So these are all important steps. There isn't one that I would oppose. And this could become a model for reforms in other jurisdictions. So the Washington Post published a deep dive, 19 pages when I printed it out, on Joe Biden's record on policing. And it's a pretty ugly record. Going back 26 years ago, he relied on a guy named Tom Scotto, who essentially wrote the bill that carried Biden's name. The one that added 100,000 cops, that was Bill Clinton's idea, but it was Joe Biden who put it into legislative form. And this guy, Scotto, was the president of the National Association of Police Organizations. He had full access for 6 months to waltz into Biden's office at any time. And he said that Joe Biden never, ever, ever said no. There wasn't one thing when he said no, Scotto recalled. And so this is part of the baggage that I've described. And I've joked that when Joe Biden rode the train every day from Delaware into D.C., they had to put on a baggage car just to accommodate all of his political booty. So Joe Biden also has made statements in the past that can be trotted out by the Trump campaign to say that that was Joe then and this is Joe now. And, of course, Trump tries to connect him to the defund the police movement. And Joe Biden is squirming. But here's a quote from 1993, a Senate floor speech. Joe Biden. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're victims of society. And he said that he wasn't one of those wacko liberals who only want to look at the causes of criminal behavior. And along with Hillary Clinton's comments about predatory young black men, this will be used against Joe Biden. And Alan McLeod has a great piece because it's at Mint Press News today, because Hillary Clinton has decided finally to embrace the Black Lives Matter movement. In a commentary published on her Medium blog, she writes, George Floyd's life mattered. Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor's lives mattered. Black Lives Matter. That's how she opened it. And she has avoided that, even when confronted in town halls when she was running for president in 2016. And here's the quote about the super predators. We need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They're not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel. And so when you look at the body of her record and then her service as Secretary of State, where she presided over ugly control in Haiti even after the earthquake, and in Libya, which has a large black population, she pushed for the so-called humanitarian intervention that led to a brutal civil war, the killing of Gaddafi, and some 8 years later, that civil war may be finally winding down. McLeod also cites a 2015 Democratic Party memo on dealing with Black Lives Matter, telling the activists to listen to their concerns, but instructed them clearly, don't offer support for concrete policy positions. We've come a long way, baby. So Bill Barr is poking the bear a little bit. Barr, of course, is the Attorney General who will go to every lengths to make Trump look good, to enable his most totalitarian instincts. But he went on the TV the other day on the Fox News channel, and he contradicted Trump about his trip to the White House bunker on the night of May 29th, when the protests and the confrontation with Secret Service personnel who were guarding the White House perimeter at that point got pretty dicey. And Barr admitted to Fox things were so bad that the Secret Service recommended the president go down to the bunker. We can't have that in our country. Well, Trump has tried to whitewash that and say, I'm not a scaredy cat. He said, I went down during the day. I was there for a tiny little short period of time. Tiny. And it was much more for an inspection, he said. There was no problem during the day. So it's a trivial matter, but it shows how concerned Trump is about his image, and it speaks to the motivation to bravely have the armed forces who were on the streets clear the path so that he could saunter from the press briefing in the Rose Garden directly over to St. John's Church for that bizarre and courageous, of course, photo op with the Bible. And I heard Rush Limbaugh talking about how this was such an image of strength that Trump wasn't afraid to leave the White House. Yeah, right. So now Trump has once again tweeted off the deep end. And this is based on a highly speculative report from the would-be Fox competitor, the right-wing channel based in San Diego called One America News. And I've occasionally watched it. My brother-in-law, Mike, thinks that it's fair and balanced. And so I've sat there eating popcorn with him and watching One America News when I'm visiting him. At any rate, One America filed a report suggesting that Martin Gugino, the 75-year-old man whose viral video, brutalization by the Buffalo police, who pushed him down to the ground and let him lay there bleeding and unconscious, that Martin Gugino, let's just jump to the tweet that that was based by Trump's viewing of the One America News report. Buffalo protester shoved by police could be an Antifa provocateur. 75-year-old Martin Gugino was pushed away after appearing to scan police communications in order to black out the equipment. One America News, I watched. He fell harder than was pushed. Was aiming scanner. Could be a setup? So yesterday I characterized what he was holding as a notepad. It didn't look like a phone to me, but apparently it was. And One America News speculated that he was running an app on his phone that could scan the radios of the police officers that he was kind of pointing his phone toward. And so this is just bullshit based on bullshit. But it shows that Trump really has such a fertile imagination and is desperate for a boogeyman to blame. I mean, you can't blame China for this one, right? So they now say that Mr. Gugino is some sort of a provocateur. Now, I saw a tweet from somebody who appears to know Mr. Gugino, who says that he's part of an affordable housing activist group in Buffalo called PUSH, and he also is affiliated with the Catholic Worker Organization. So the idea that he had some special phone that could pick up some data or communications from the police and that this was linked to Antifa, wow. Trump does a lot of daydreaming during his executive time when he mostly watches television looking for coverage of Trump. So here's an interesting story about Antifa. It involves Chandler Wirostek, a 24-year-old poli-sci graduate who is going to law school somewhere this fall. And Chandler Wirostek read the news that the Attorney General had declared that Antifa was engaged in domestic terrorism, and so the organization, which doesn't exist, was going to be labeled as a domestic terrorism organization. So he went on Twitter and addressed the FBI's main account and the Bureau's Charlotte office. He wrote, "Hi, I am the leader of Charlotte NC Antifa. Direct message me for my address, or I can turn myself in. I'd be happy to let you test your bullshit terrorism statute in a U.S. court. Anyone who thinks anti-fascists are the bad guys are fascists." And he signed the tweet, hashtag I am Antifa. So 2 days later, somebody from the FBI called, and Warostek said, well, first they called my mom, and then when they got me, he was in his kitchen. So he put the phone on speaker and got a friend to start filming his side of the conversation with the then unnamed FBI agent. So the agent asked, what makes you email the FBI saying you're the leader of Antifa in Charlotte? Warostek explained that he was not, in fact, the local leader of Antifa, and the tweet was just a statement of solidarity. So for some reason, the friend maybe ran out of space on his phone, but he stopped filming the call. But according to Warostek, the agent told him that's what he suspected, and he was simply following a superior's orders. He asked Warostek if he knew any Antifa members or had any information about the movement's structure, which shows the FBI agent doesn't know anything about Antifa. And then he asked the young man if he'd be interested in becoming an informant for the FBI. Now, oh boy. Recently, somebody posted online an interview between two FBI agents who cold called Malcolm X and offered him the opportunity to become an informant. And his answer was priceless. Anyway, Warostek said, well, sure, just send me the information. Maybe he wants to see how much it pays before he accepts or declines that opportunity. So yesterday I reported on the guy in Seattle who drove his truck toward or through a crowd of protesters, and when a black man objected, gunfire ensued, the black guy was dead, and the driver was given kind of kid-glove treatment by the police officers who took him into custody. Well, I can't say it was at exactly the same time, but also on Sunday in Virginia, a man who rammed his truck into a crowd of peaceful protesters, it turns out, is not an Antifa leader. He is a Ku Klux Klan leader. His name is Harry Rogers, age 36, quote, an admitted leader of the Ku Klux Klan and a propagandist for Confederate ideology. That's according to the prosecutor in the case. In a statement, Taylor, the prosecutor, he said that Mr. Rogers, not the TV guy, had been driving recklessly down Lakeside Avenue in the median, drove up to the protesters, revved the engine, and drove right into them. He's facing charges of assault and battery, attempted malicious wounding, and felony vandalism. The office is investigating possible hate crime charges. Rogers is also known as Skip Rogers. And in a photo that was found online, he appears to resemble the same Harry Rogers, can be seen wearing KKK robes and carrying a Confederate flag outside a World War II memorial. And that was published, a photo in a newspaper in 2016. And also, I believe on Sunday, here in California, in Bakersfield, a drug trafficking white supremacist hit and killed Robert Forbes, an African American. Police refused to arrest or handcuff him, allowing him to smoke a cigarette while they protected him from angry protesters. Police claimed that the injuries to Mr. Forbes, which he died from, were only moderate to major, and blamed the protesters themselves for causing the crash by being in the road. And according to local media, the driver has yet to be arrested. We have two more cases surfacing of a black man and a brown man who were in police custody and died through asphyxiation. A year ago in March, Javier Ambler was driving home and this was in Texas. Police attempted to pull him over after noticing that his bright headlights were on while facing oncoming traffic. This occurred near Austin. Now, the driver, Ambler, refused to stop, according to the police report. Can't always trust those police reports, resulting in a chase before he crashed his vehicle near downtown Austin. Ambler got out of the car, showed his hands, but then moved towards the police car and was tasered by Officer J.J. Johnson, a black Williamson County deputy who was being filmed for a TV show at that time, a TV reality show. And then another white officer arrived. Ambler was hit with a taser 2 times. An Austin police officer arrived at the scene as the group of cops struggled to handcuff Ambler. Body camera video from that officer recorded the final minutes of Ambler's life. He tells deputies 4 times that he can't breathe, and he pleads, "Save me." He said, "I have congestive heart failure. I am not resisting." And then one of the deputies fired an additional taser round or blast at this man who just disclosed that he couldn't breathe and he has an illness and said, "I am not resisting." And the final hit with the taser led to Mr. Ambler going unconscious, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. His death was ruled a homicide by the coroner. Autopsy revealed he died of congestive heart failure, and in combination with forcible restraint. Then there's the case in Las Cruces, New Mexico, of 40-year-old Antonio Valenzuela. He was placed in a neck restraint by Officer Christopher Smelzer during an arrest on the 29th of February this year. Valenzuela, who was tasered twice by police, became unresponsive and paramedics were unable to save him at the scene. The autopsy said he died from asphyxial injuries from the chokehold. And this combination of limiting people's ability to breathe while blasting them with taser voltage, we can see that in some cases it is deadly. And I've always opposed the deployment of tasers, described as less lethal, because, well, honestly, I think that's a lie. Today in the show file for this podcast, I am posting a link to a video compilation of numerous incidents, dozens of them, of police brutality that's occurred over the past 2 weeks all across the country. And today, well, let me just mention that in the video compilation, you can see the sequence where a New York City police officer brutally shoved a young woman to the ground and called her a bitch after she asked him why he told her to get out of the street. The victim is 20-year-old Dunya Zaire. The officer is Vincent D'Andrea. He is now charged with misdemeanor assault, criminal mischief, harassment, and menacing. This happened on Friday, May 29th. He's been suspended without pay. He turned himself in early on Tuesday at the 84th Precinct Station in Brooklyn. And he is the first to be charged when we know that there are, I won't say countless, but many, many incidents of excessive force and brutality used by New York police officers over the past 2 weeks. I trust he will not be the last. There is a second officer who was nearby in the incident, and he has not been named publicly, but he is being further investigated as well. Another situation in Brooklyn was caught on videotape because a man who is a filmmaker, 37-year-old Christopher Frierson, had a press pass. He was videotaping the scene as riot police came up and pushed back a crowd of people. And a cordon of police suddenly charged at him after a nearby woman was captured on his video throwing a water bottle at the cops. And even though he was clearly displaying a press badge, the approaching phalanx of officers were just spraying pepper spray indiscriminately, including right into people's faces. And if you look at this reel, the compilation of these scenes from across the country, you see cops spraying the pepper spray from industrial-sized bottles in huge quantities. And maybe you recall a few years ago there was a protest at the University of California, Davis, not far from me. And a bunch of officers, they're campus cops, but they got fired. Well, maybe they were county. I have to look that up. I don't. Maybe they weren't all campus cops. But there was this one guy who was just squirting everybody like he was pumping out silly string. And the pepper spray certainly isn't deadly to most people. But Mr. Frierson captured it on video, and if you follow the link in the show file to The Guardian, you can see that video for yourself and the strong reaction of Mr. Frierson. Also, a new study found that police have been responsible for the vast majority of assaults on journalists. And you've seen many of those. I think there are a couple of those incidents that are included in the compilation video as well. In San Jose, not far from me here in California, a 27-year-old community activist who helped train police officers on implicit bias was trying to de-escalate a confrontation between police and protesters. And what did he get for it? He was shot with a rubber bullet by the cops that he has been training. And the young man's name is Derek Sanderlin. He's African-American. He said, I really just couldn't watch it anymore and just kind of made like a parallel walkover, put my hands up, just stood in the line of fire and asked them please not to do this. The video shows officers leveling weapons at Sanderlin, who raised his hands, made no aggressive movement toward the cops, and moments later, they unleashed rubber bullets, one of which struck Sanderlin and ruptured one of his testicles. He said, I paused for a moment, like maybe this doesn't hurt, and falling afterwards is like the most painful experience. It required surgery, and he may not be able to have children. His attorney, Sarah Marino, they were aiming for a body part that is prohibited when using those type of riot guns. You're not meant to aim at the groin or the head, ever. But cops operate with impunity, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that if something bad happens, their fellow officers rally around them, they whitewash the reports, and if that doesn't work, well, they might face a letter in their file or some sort of reprimand. And here in California, 2 years ago, we changed the law to lift the lid of secrecy on the personnel file of officers who have broken the law or who have been disciplined for various reasons. And in New York State, the equivalent in the state's civil code is Section 50-A. And it appears that there is momentum to repeal Section 50A in New York State. And in an op-ed by Genia Belafonte, she writes, 50A enshrines police misconduct in secrecy, shielding the personnel and disciplinary records of police officers from public view so that there is often no way for a victim to know if an abusive officer has a history of dubious behavior unless someone has happened to sue him. So this is one of the issues behind part of the legislation that House Democrats introduced yesterday to require a national database, essentially, of bad cops, to keep them from moving from one agency to another after they have, committed any sort of offenses. And Governor Cuomo of New York, who is pretty pro-cop, and boy, so is his brother Chris on CNN. It's hard to take. Anyway, the Gov has said that he will support its repeal. But Ms. Belafonte writes, more dispiriting to advocates is the incongruity of Mayor Bill de Blasio's position. Although he ran for office on an agenda of police reform, he has not only neglected to make any impassioned effort to repeal the law, but has worked instead to expand its power. He's managed to earn the disdain of the police department while at the same time enraging the liberal electorate. And that's true. He continues to defend the cops as if he thinks they're going to start to be nice to him, that they're going to like him. And, Bill, someday you'll figure that out. I want to recommend a very well-written piece, a lengthy op-ed published in the New York Times today by Michelle Alexander. A few quotes. Trump's leadership has been disastrous, but it would be a mistake to place the blame on him alone. In part, we find ourselves here for the same reasons a civil war tore our nation apart more than 100 years ago. Too many citizens prefer to cling to brutal and unjust systems than to give up political power. The perceived benefits of white supremacy, and an exploitative economic system. If we don't learn the lessons of history and choose a radically different path forward, we may lose our last chance at creating a truly inclusive, egalitarian democracy. She makes a number of really good points. Everyone knows that the cops who killed George Floyd never would have been fired or arrested if a courageous black girl had not filmed the incident on her phone and posted it to social media. Deep down, we already knew this kind of thing happens to black people. And later, she writes, we cannot solve a problem we don't understand. Trump would not be president, George Floyd would not be dead if after the Civil War our nation had committed itself to reparations, reconciliation, and atonement for the land and people that colonizers stole, sold, and plundered. A little later, she says, given this history, it should come as no surprise that growing numbers of people are working to defund the police and reimagine justice. Our nation has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. More than 95% of arrests every year are for nonviolent offenses like loitering, fare evasion, and theft. Some, like Eric Garner, are arrested for selling loose cigarettes, or others minor forgery, which resulted, as you know, in George Floyd's being suffocated to death by the police. And that forgery, by the way, we have no background on. We don't know that George Floyd had his own, high-end copy machine and was printing his own $20 bills. It's just as possible that somebody passed a counterfeit bill to him and he simply passed it along. And then Michelle Alexander goes out of her way to praise Bernie Sanders in a fair way. She says, no matter what you think about Bernie as a man or as a candidate, and I wish he was much better at addressing racial issues like reparations, we all owe him and countless organizers a debt of gratitude for pushing universal health care, paid family leave, free college education, a $15 minimum wage, and many other economic rights into the mainstream. The coronavirus crisis proved that Sanders was right all along, that health care and other economic rights should be considered part of our social contract, not special benefits for those who are lucky enough to be employed by companies that grant discretionary benefits. Younger black people seem to understand that the neoliberal democratic politics of the past will not take us where we need to go, and they supported Sanders by significant margins in the polls. And in her close, Michelle Alexander says, I find it difficult to call our nation a democracy in light of the rampant voter suppression, the denial of voting rights to millions of people with felony records, and our pay-to-play political system that allows billionaires and corporations to more or less buy politicians and elections. But if you're tempted to believe that voting Trump out of office isn't urgently necessary in November because the system is already rigged, please read Astra Taylor's book, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Sure Miss It When It's Gone. And all the way from Australia, Caitlin Johnstone offers a warning. The Democratic Party exists to co-opt and kill authentic change. And she uses the Beckett play Waiting for Godot as her theme in this essay today. And then says, Barack Obama made a whole political career out of this. People elected him because he promised hope and change. Then for 8 years, whenever hopeful people demanded changes, he'd say, yes, we all need to get together and have a conversation about that. He'd express sympathy, give a moving speech, and then nothing would happen. The actors remain motionless, and Godot never comes. Democratic leaders are currently under fire for staging a ridiculous performative display of sympathy for George Floyd by kneeling for 8 minutes while wearing kente cloth, a traditional African textile. The Democrats' response is to put on a children's play using black culture as a prop and advance a toothless reform bill whose approach we've already established is worthless, which will actually increase funding to police departments. And she says it's blue states with Democratic governors and cities with Democratic mayors where the bulk of the police brutality that people are objecting to is occurring. The Democrats are going out of their way to spin police brutality as the result of Trump's presidency, but facts and evidence say America's violent and increasingly militarized police force would be a problem if every seat in every office in America were blue. And she also notes something that I had not heard, that the Tom Cotton op-ed that led to the dismissal of the opinion editor of the New York Times for its publication last week originated in a request from the op-ed team to the senator. He didn't write that just because he held those opinions. He was asked to put a column together that could be published in the Times, which wrote the inflammatory headline, Send in the Troops. Caitlin makes some really good points there. And the Democratic Party has to be pressured. It cannot be trusted. Democratic Congressman Al Green, who spoke at the George Floyd funeral in Houston today, is calling for a Department of Reconciliation. He said, we survived slavery, but we didn't reconcile. We survived segregation, but we didn't reconcile. It's time for a Department of Reconciliation in the highest land, in the highest office. It's time to have someone who is going to make it his or her business to seek reconciliation for black people in the United States of America. And that slogan, defund the police, has gotten a lot of attention in the last few days. But I think it's important to note that David Sirota has put together a list of how the Republican leaders who chortle and turn red in the face about defunding police departments have pushed to defund agencies that police different functions regulated by the federal government. For example, the U.S. Chemical Safety Board, which polices major industrial accidents, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which polices the violation of workers' rights, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, also known as Peekaboo, which polices the accounting industry, the Securities and Exchange Commission's Reserve Fund, which has been gutted by the Trump administration, the agencies that police corporate mergers, the Independent Law Enforcement Agency that policed agribusiness monopolies, and the creation of Elizabeth Warren, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which polices the financial industry and works to protect customers from fraud. I want to remind everybody that the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund is funded, and we are granting $100 to people who make a request. And so if $100 could help you get through the week, buy some groceries, fill up your tank, help pay off a past due bill, just drop me an email, peter@peterbcollins.com, and I would be happy to help you out. It's not huge. It's not the genius grant from the Harper, what is it? I want to say Harper's because of Harper's Magazine. The MacArthur Foundation. It's not a big one like that. It's not winning the lottery. It's a little helping hand at a difficult time. Just email peter@peterbcollins.com. Now, this is comparable to the Me Too movement, where we are seeing the George Floyd protests reach into the workplace. The editor of Bon Appetit magazine, who several years back posed in brownface. He's a white guy who was impersonating a Puerto Rican. Adam Rappaport said, "I'm stepping down as editor-in-chief of Bon Appetit to reflect on the work that I need to do as a human being and to allow Bon Appetit to get to a better place." The founder of the operation called Reformation, and if I have it right, this is a clothing brand where the people who participate order some clothes, and they can either rent them and send them back, or they can rent them, and if they like them, they can pay to keep them. Well, the head of the founder of that company, Yael Aflalo, apologized after a former employee accused her of creating a racist and unsafe environment for black staffers. The controversy began May 30th after the brand made a donation to causes including Black Lives Matter and the NAACP. It prompted multiple comments about how Reformation has treated black people. In particular, Aflalo was accused of not giving black employees the same work opportunities, treated some of them with disgust over the years. And one other example of this, the founder of CrossFit, who tweeted some snarky comments about George Floyd and the protests. Well, he is facing a freeze-out from some of his suppliers like Reebok and from other gym owners who license the CrossFit name. The founder's name is Greg Glassman, and he's getting quite a faceful of comments. I continue to search for the origins of the coronavirus, and while I don't have any evidence that it was created in a lab, I consider that a possibility. And so Forbes magazine posted online 3 days ago an article headlined, "Norway Scientist Claims Report Proves Coronavirus Was Lab-Made." Somebody shared that link. I clicked on it. And when you get to Forbes.com, it says that the page is no longer active. So then somebody referred me to the Wayback Machine at Internet Archive. And when I clicked on one of the links there, I was able to see the article, the Forbes logo, the headline, "Norway Scientist Claims Report Proves Coronavirus Was Lab-Made." And then it flickers, and the page goes blank. Now, I just do not support censorship. I want to find the truth about the origins of the coronavirus. And this is truly un-American. And as a capitalist tool, that's what Forbes calls itself. They should be raising a big stink about this. UC Berkeley scientists have released a study that was peer-reviewed and published in Nature magazine on Monday, analyzing the infection control policies, the shelter-in-place, lockdowns, whatever you want to call them, that occurred starting in March. And they did a series of projections on what would have happened just up through April 6th if those measures had been, had not been taken. The social distancing, some people had already started wearing face masks, even though it hadn't been recommended at that point, and the use of hand sanitizers, and most importantly, not going to work, staying at home. Well, they estimate that this helped avert 4.8 million coronavirus cases in the United States, including 1.7 million cases in California. And when they looked worldwide, they said that it helped avert or delay 530 million infections in 6 countries that they examined, including 60 million here in the United States. Now, these are projections. I realize that. But I know many people who look back and say, we never filled up our hospitals, at least not in most areas. New York is the exception. But they didn't need to use the hospital ships. And so there are a lot of people who look back now, and in hindsight, they say, we didn't need to do this. Just let people die. And I think it's pretty clear that far more would be dead today had we not taken the actions that we did. Here's our COVID-19 update for today, prepared by Linda Lewis. The worldwide case count is upwards of 7 million now, with almost 400,000 deaths worldwide. In the U.S., we're pressing up on 2 million cases reported, with 111,000 reported dead from COVID-related conditions as of today. And there were 18,000 new cases reported yesterday. And we currently have 217,000 people hospitalized for COVID infection. And CNN is reporting that at least 28 states and the District of Columbia are not following the reporting guidelines for COVID-19 cases laid out by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And the biggest states include California, Florida, New York, and Texas. And though the reporting guidelines are voluntary, states not reporting probable cases likely undercount the number of people infected and make it difficult for officials to get the true picture of where things stand in the pandemic. 3 states are showing significant increases, 40% in Arkansas. This is hospitalization rates, by the way, 31% in Arizona, 36% in Utah. In Arizona, hospitals are expressing major concerns about the numbers they're seeing. Banner Health, which is a major hospital operator, raised a major red flag Monday, tweeting that since May 15th, their number of COVID patients on ventilators has quadrupled. In Utah, about 21% of total cases were confirmed in the last 8 days alone. Officials there attributed much of the increase to the state's economy reopening. Roughly a third of the new cases are also tied to an outbreak at a meatpacking facility in Cache Valley. And in Arkansas, close to half of new cases reported occurred in northwest Arkansas, Washington, and Benton counties. The area is home to Tyson's Foods and multiple poultry processing plants. The Health and Human Services Department is pushing out new funding to the hospitals that really need it, distributing about $15 billion to providers participating in Medicaid and CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, that have not yet received funds from the authorized pools of money that were pushed out by the Congress. Also, the American people were assured that we could get testing and that any trips to the doctors and hospitals would be free. Yeah, government health care. But there were no limits on charges for out-of-network testing, and patients can be billed if insurers refuse to pay. One national insurer was billed almost $7,000 for a COVID test in Texas. So in response, insurance regulators are taking action to protect patients and, of course, the insurance companies. In Washington State, the insurance commissioner, Mike Kreidler, issued an emergency order banning labs for billing insured patients for doctor-ordered COVID-19 diagnostic tests. And Harvard has a new study out that analyzed commercial satellite imagery of 5 major Wuhan hospitals, showing dramatic spikes in auto traffic last fall that suggest the novel coronavirus may have been present and spreading through central China long before the outbreak was first reported to the world. John Brownstein, Harvard medical professor who led the research, said the traffic increase coincided with elevated queries on a Chinese internet search engine for certain symptoms that would later be determined closely associated with the novel coronavirus. And over at Mint Press News, Alan McLeod, appearing in the Mint Press podcast, said, in the last 30 years, U.S. billionaire wealth soared by over 1,100%, while median household wealth increased by about 5%. In 1990, the total wealth held by America's billionaire class was $240 billion. Today, that number stands at $2.95 trillion. Thus, America's billionaires accrued more wealth in just the past 3 weeks than they made in total prior to 1980. Well, one of the victims of COVID is America's retail industry and the shopping malls that chains populate. And a new study by Coresight Research tells us that America's retailers will shutter 20 to 25,000 stores this year, as much as 60% of the closures occurring in malls. That's a sharp increase, not quite double the 15,000 closures that were estimated earlier this year. Well, in Georgia, it's Election Day, and that means that voters who are purged from the rolls are showing up and being told, hey, your name's not on the list. And it also means with the rollout of new voting machines that there are huge lines. In some areas around Atlanta, people are waiting over 3 hours to vote. And the backups, in part, are caused by the introduction of new machines, and the election workers didn't know how to operate them. And actress Rainey Branch said she and many acquaintances requested but never received absentee ballots, forcing her to come out in person. She says, I stayed in line despite a 3-hour, 10-minute wait because my ancestors sacrificed too much for me to be stopped from exercising the right to vote. Many voters and poll workers are unfamiliar with the new ballot marking devices that were deployed for the first time statewide today, replacing a paperless electronic voting system that a federal judge declared insecure. I haven't evaluated these ballot marking machines, but we'll see if they're any better than the audit-proof touchscreen machines that they replaced. And finally today, the Trump administration's efforts to isolate Iran and Venezuela have failed. And in a remarkable editorial today, the Washington Post, which supports the isolation of Iran and the isolation of Venezuela, has said that the most visible result of the policy to date has been to bring the two nations together to orchestrate an embarrassing display of America's impotence. And it cites the arrival of, last Tuesday, 5 Iranian tankers bringing gasoline to help restart the economy in Venezuela and spare parts for oil production facilities. They say the result was a propaganda victory for the Maduro and Khamenei regimes, which show no signs either of yielding to U.S. pressure or succumbing to domestic unrest. More cooperation between them seems to be in train. Maduro said he would soon visit Tehran, and he recently appointed a key ally of Iran as his oil minister. And the editorial concludes, the strengthening alliance between the two states illustrates the downside of Trump policies that aim for regime change, but aren't able to deliver it, or even to contain the inevitable blowback. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.